When Phil Robertson died on May 25, 2025, the headlines called it the end of an era for Duck Dynasty. But for the Robertson family, it was something much smaller and much heavier than a headline. It was the end of the loudest, most stubborn, most unshakable voice in their lives. And in the weeks that followed, as they sorted through what he left behind, they discovered that the real inheritance wasn't the money. It was the weight of everything he'd survived to build it. This is the story of how a poor kid from Vivian, Louisiana, who once lived without electricity or running water, became a millionaire, a television icon, and a lightning rod for controversy, and how the last year of his life became the most quietly emotional chapter of all. In December 2024, the Robertsons sat down for an episode of their podcast, Unashamed, and told their audience something they'd clearly been dreading. Phil had early-stage Alzheimer's disease. For a family that had built an entire brand on Phil's booming voice and iron certainty, the announcement landed hard. Fans assumed it meant years of slow fading, the kind of gradual decline they'd seen in other public figures. What actually happened inside the Robertson home moved much faster than that. By early 2025, the signs were impossible to ignore. Phil would lose his place mid-sentence. He'd ask the same question twice within a few minutes. Simple tasks that used to be automatic now required patience and help. For a man who had built an empire with his own hands, who had hunted through Louisiana swamps in every kind of weather, who had preached with total conviction for decades, the loss of that sharpness was its own kind of grief, long before he actually passed. In April 2025, his son Jace spoke about it publicly, and there was no spin in his voice. "He's not good," Jace said on the podcast. "We're making him comfortable, and we're doing the best we can." It was a short, plain statement, but it told the audience everything the family had been living with in private. The disease wasn't just taking Phil's memory. It was taking his strength, his voice, and slowly, his independence. Phil had talked about death for years the way he talked about everything else, without fear, without hedging. He believed dying wasn't an ending but a handoff, a return to something better. He used to tell his kids not to grieve when the day came. "Dance," he'd say. "Sing. Don't cry." It became something close to a family motto, repeated so often it almost lost its weight, until the day it actually mattered, and none of them could manage to follow it. Phil Robertson died at home on May 25, 2025. He was 79 years old. His daughter-in-law Corey Robertson posted the news first, writing that the family was celebrating that our father, husband, and grandfather is now with the Lord. She quoted the Apostle Paul, the same scripture Phil had leaned on his whole life, about not grieving like people with no hope. Willie added his own tribute soon after, and Jace confirmed the news publicly as well, telling followers his father had gone to be with the Lord. There was no grand production to the funeral that followed. No press pool, no politicians angling for a photo, no cameras outside the church. Just family, longtime friends, and the particular kind of quiet that only exists after decades of shared history. They prayed. They told stories. Some of them almost certainly tried to follow Phil's old instruction not to cry, and almost certainly failed, because the loss was too big and the love underneath it too real. Here's where a lot of the stories floating around online start to invent things that were never reported. Handwritten letters to each child, an itemized breakdown of exactly who got what and why, private confessions read aloud in a lawyer's office. None of that has ever been confirmed by the family or reported by a credible outlet, and it's worth being honest about that instead of pretending otherwise. What is publicly known is more modest, but still meaningful. Phil's net worth at the time of his death was widely estimated in the $10 million range, built over 5 decades. The Duck Commander Company he started by hand-carving duck calls in 1972, the Duck Dynasty years, the books, the speaking circuit, and years of conservative media appearances. His son Willie had already stepped into leadership of Duck Commander well before Phil's death, effectively running the business as CEO while Phil's health declined. Corey and Willie were also the driving forces behind Duck Dynasty. The revival, the A&E reboot that premiered in the summer of 2025, a show built around the next generation of the family, without Phil on screen for the first time since the franchise began. So while the specific contents of his will remain a private family matter, the bigger picture is clear enough without needing to invent details. Phil spent his final years quietly transferring responsibility, not just assets, to the children who had spent their whole lives working beside him. The business kept running. The podcast kept recording. The family kept showing up for each other. That, more than any single number in a legal document, was the inheritance that mattered. To understand why Phil's family reacted the way they did, you have to go back to where he came from, because it explains almost everything about the man he became. Phil Alexander Robertson was born in 1946 in Vivian, Louisiana, one of 7 kids in a family that had next to nothing. There was no electricity in the house growing up. No indoor plumbing. Meals depended on what could be pulled out of the woods and water around them. Deer, fish, squirrel, whatever the land provided that week. Hunting wasn't a hobby for Phil as a kid. It was how the family ate. That kind of upbringing either breaks a person or hardens them, and it hardened Phil. He grew into someone fiercely self-reliant, deeply skeptical of anything that pulled him away from the land, and completely unbothered by what other people thought of him, a trait that would define both his business success and his controversies decades later. He was also, as it turned out, a genuinely gifted athlete. Phil earned a football scholarship to Louisiana Tech and became the school's starting quarterback in 1966 and 1967. His backup at the time was a young player named Terry Bradshaw, who would go on to a Hall of Fame NFL. Run over by large, violent men on a football field. It sounded like a joke, but it was really a statement about who he was, someone who valued his own freedom over almost anything else, including fame he hadn't even had yet. In 1972, Phil turned that same stubborn independence into a business. He started hand-carving duck calls out of his home and shipping them out one order at a time. It was a shoestring operation with no guarantee of ever becoming more than that. His wife, Kay, who married him at just 17 and was pregnant with their first child not long after, stood beside him through years where money was tight, and the family leaned on faith and whatever they could gather themselves just to get by. But Phil's personal life during this stretch wasn't the steady, faith-driven story fans would later come to know from television. In his 20s and early 30s, he struggled badly with alcohol and a temper that put real strain on his marriage. By his own account in later interviews, there were stretches where he was absent from his family for days at a time, consumed by drinking and reckless behavior. Kay held the household together through that period largely on her own, never certain what version of Phil would walk back through the door, or whether he would at all. The turning point came in a small church in West Monroe. Phil has described walking in restless and resistant, and walking out changed. He committed to Christianity with the same total conviction he brought to everything else in his life. And from that point forward, he rebuilt his marriage, made things right with his kids as best he could, and redirected all of that stubborn energy into work, family, and faith. That conversion didn't just change Phil individually. It became the organizing principle for everything the family did afterward, from how they ran the business to the books Phil eventually wrote to the podcast he later hosted with Jace. Slowly, then quickly, Duck Commander grew from a kitchen table operation into a real company, especially once Willie returned from college with ideas about how to modernize and expand it. By the time cameras eventually showed up decades later, the Robertsons weren't newcomers to hard work. They were a family who had already survived the hardest version of their story once, in private, long before anyone was watching. Most of America met Phil Robertson in 2012, when Duck Dynasty premiered on A&E. What was pitched as a simple reality show about a family duck call business turned into a genuine cultural phenomenon almost overnight. At its peak, the show pulled in more than 11 million viewers a week, drawn to Phil's blunt, unfiltered takes on faith, family, and discipline. Whatever people saw on screen wasn't a performance. It was largely just Phil being Phil, on camera instead of off it. That same bluntness led directly to the biggest controversy of his career. In a 2013 interview with GQ, Phil made comments about homosexuality and about race relations under Jim Crow that set off an immediate and intense backlash. A&E suspended him. Advertisers pulled back. Civil rights groups called for accountability. At the same time, conservative audiences rallied hard in his defense, and the backlash to the backlash was loud enough that A&E reinstated him within about a week. Phil never walked the comments back or apologized, saying his views came directly from his understanding of Scripture. It was a defining moment. For some, proof of unshakable conviction. For others, proof of exactly what critics feared. He carried both reactions for the rest of his life without seeming particularly moved by either one. In the years after, Phil leaned further into conservative politics, publicly backing Ted Cruz during the 2016 Republican primary and later supporting Donald Trump. Duck Dynasty itself started to lose steam in the ratings and wrapped up in 2017 after 11 seasons, spinning off into a few other Robertson-branded shows before the family launched Duck Dynasty. The revival years later centered on Willie, Corey, and the next generation, a show Phil didn't appear in on camera, but one that carried his fingerprints all the way through it. Even as Alzheimer's took hold in his final months, Phil kept recording a handful of episodes of Unashamed, and listeners were struck by how clear and steady his voice still sounded, almost out of step with how sick his family said he'd become. Those recordings now sit as something close to a final message, not a farewell speech exactly, just Phil talking the way he always had, plainly and without hesitation, right up until he couldn't anymore. That's the version of him the family chose to center after he was gone. Not the TV star, not the millionaire, but the man who nearly lost everything to his own temper in his 20s and spent the next 5 decades trying to make it right. The fortune he built was real, and by most estimates, sizable. But for the Robertsons, what actually mattered in the weeks after his death wasn't the number attached to his estate. It was the fact that he'd spent his last years making sure the people, and the business, and the faith he cared about most were positioned to keep going without him. Willie is now running Duck Commander day to day. Jace and the rest of the family have kept Unashamed going. The revival is carrying the Robertson name into a new generation of television, on a platform Phil helped build but will never see. None of that required a dramatic letter-reading scene in a lawyer's office to be true. It just required a family that had already been tested decades earlier and had learned, the hard way, how to hold together when things got difficult. Phil Robertson asked his family not to cry when he died. They cried anyway, because the man they lost had spent almost 60 years teaching them exactly how much there was worth crying over.